Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another session here at Room for Discussion. Today, we'll discuss the future of your currency, your unit of account, your store of value, and your medium of exchange, the euro. A young currency that has faced, in recent times, immense difficulties. But however, it has persisted, and we still have it today. Today, to have this conversation, we're joined by two prominent European economists. Daniel Gros, he's the current director of the Center for European Policy Studies, and Enrico Perotti, who's a professor of international finance at our very own University of Amsterdam. So without further ado, please give them a warm round of applause.
Should we shake hands? Yeah, welcome also on my behalf. Welcome on our couches.
So I think it would be nice to start this interview by discussing the idealism behind the euro, the political idealism it had when it was first introduced. Mr. Perotti, Italy was one of the countries that had the most support for the euro membership. Did you share back 20 years ago the same sympathies with your fellow Italians?
Yes. No, I remember discussing with my friends and colleagues the great hope that, joining the euro would have finally the Germans save us from ourselves. Didn't quite work that way. More than that, I think, there is an aspirational aspect, and it's not political, it's cultural. I mean, I am European more than I'm Italian, I think. And I say that even then, where I hadn't lived already,
So it wasn't only an economic argument, in your opinion, it was also a cultural aspiration. You felt this strong sentiment towards Europe.
Yes, but so the European Union was always that, I believe. The monetary union was probably set up a bit with the idea that, well, okay, maybe we don't have all the pieces to take the next step, but if we take this half step, then
we'll get us there.
Then the details, then we are there.
How about you, Mr. Gross? We understand you co-authored a paper also at the time that contributed to the architecture of the euro. So how did you feel about that new currency of ours?
I mean, I can confirm what you said. I think these steps in European integration were always a mixture between some dose of idealism, but they had to make sense, economic sense. And this applied also to monetary union, which actually has been a dream of many policymakers and academics for a long, long time. The first report on how to have a monetary union in Europe is the famous, for some at least, famous Berner Plan of 1970. And then for a long time, nothing. But the idea was very simple. During the 70s and 80s, most people thought the so-called German or Germanic model, Dutch and German model, of having an independent central bank with low inflation, that it actually would yield better economic results. And fundamentally, then we thought, why don't we adopt that kind of model at the European level?
Extend that success factor, okay.
And that's why the Italians can benefit from price stability, and everything will be fine. That's what we thought then.
Yeah, that's what you thought then, but also at the time, I believe there has been criticism by economists on that project, arguing that the European Union would not meet the conditions of an optimal currency area. So the conditions that a geographical area would have to fulfill to benefit more from a common currency than from continuing national currencies. What did you make of that argument at the time?
Yes, I mean, I was involved in these discussions and I always thought it was a bit overrated. The idea was that we needed to have more labor mobility and more flexibility in wages to be, quote unquote, more like the Americans, so that our monetary union could benefit from flexibility within countries. With hindsight, I must say that these were actually not the main problems that we encountered, but it was the almost total neglect of financial markets and their inherent instability, which in the 1980s and 1990s, when we discussed the plans, were just not on our radar screens.
Some compare it with another event of the 1990s, which was the German reunification, as in saying that it was economically premature, but politically paramount and necessary.
No, there I would disagree.
There you disagree.
I think German unification is quite a different event because it came explicitly with lots of transfers from Western to Eastern Germany. And with the promise that living conditions would be equalized between the old and the new lenders. That was not the case for monetary union. Actually, it was explicitly said there should be no transfers, and every country would remain responsible for basically the welfare of its own citizens. The only thing they would get, so to speak, from Europe would be a stable currency.
One of the key selling points, Mr. Gros and Mr. Perotti, of the Eurozone was that it will bring about convergence, that we will see Italy, Greece converge to the levels of income that we would see back then in the northern countries. 20 years after it was introduced, Mr. Gros, has the euro fulfilled this expectation?
This was not a promise. There was
stability, peace, convergence.
No, just one thing at a time. There was no implicit promise, or explicit also, that creating a common currency would yield to the same level of productivity, living standards, and so on. I repeat, actually, it was stated in the Maastricht Treaty there should be no bailout of member countries.
But is it fair to say it was an expectation?
I'm going to come to that.
Okay.
And that's actually interesting because the research at the time in the early 1990s, so based on data until the 80s, was of course based on the United States. And there was a lot of research showing that in the United States there had been a convergence over the last 40 years up to the 1980s, and then the expectation that this would continue, and therefore the expectation that in Europe we would also have convergence. Now we are almost 30 years later, and actually we observe that this was exactly the point at which convergence stopped within the United States, right? It actually, convergence continued for a while in Europe, but unfortunately it was partially based in some cases on bubbles of unstable capital inflows, and that we didn't realize. And therefore that has turned around. Otherwise, I would say within the monetary union, convergence has actually continued, except for those countries which have weak institutions.
Yeah. So which countries are those? You would say then the more Baltic states have converged, or Eastern European states that have joined the euro, those have converged?
Yes, and basically everybody is converging more or less, except Greece and southern Italy.
Yeah. Still, however, these countries not only have not converged, they've diverged since the financial crisis, right? How does that...
Yeah, what I always say, you have to really don't have to take the peak of the financial crisis and say, what disaster. You have to take the upswing and the rate, have to take everything together, right? So you have to go through it. And even if you cut through that, for Greece you have an up and down, and now they're back to their starting point. And for Italy, you didn't even have an up, you have only a slow downwards moving relatively. Yeah. And that is difficult to explain with financial markets.
So per capita income has fallen in Italy. See, if you compare the point, the beginning of monetary union. And that is a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? If you take the basic neoclassical framing of Mando framing, because that's, you wouldn't expect that.
So how come? Do you have any answer to how that Italy has diverged compared to other Eurozone economies?
Yes, well, so if you think structurally there are, if you think how, I want to make the following point. You put together monetary union with different countries, and the country is sufficiently different, it's going to be all kind of reallocation and redistribution. That's the general point. This is not in the discussion that you see much in the newspaper or in parliaments, but it's a bit of a fact. So let me talk briefly about specifically a country like Italy. Italy ended up benefiting from much lower interest rate. Italy had huge rise in public spending in the 70s and 80s. The problem with Italian debt is an old problem. It's nothing to do with the euro. Italy has actually run a primary surplus for 20 years, which is much more you could say of, say, France or others. But of course, if you start with a huge problem, you carry it on your back. Now, Italy lost a bit the chance when interest rate came down to bring down the debt. And that is absolutely part of the responsibility of political class, some individuals, Italians, I don't question that. Has something to do with a weak institution, which would be a long discussion.
Meaning that we should not have expected them to drop down their stock of debt.
I don't know, did Belgium do it? I don't think anyone did very well on that.
In the 1990s, Belgium had a higher debt to GDP ratio than Italy. And actually the cost of public debt was higher in Belgium than Italy as a share of GDP.
So I guess they did better, since now we are first.
And then in, let's say, beginning of the 2000s, as you said, when they came down, particularly in 2001, I still remember, there was a small recession, right?
In Belgium?
No, worldwide, global.
Okay,
9/11, you remember,
yeah.
right? And the reaction in Italy was, as you said, recession, we have to get out, let's spend more. In Belgium, they had their multi-annual plan to get the debt level down. They kept having a very large primary surplus. And that's why 6 or 7 years later, when the crisis hit, Belgium was fine. Its debt level was, I think at that point, 80%, whereas Italy was still above 100 and got hit.
So we can attribute this difference in decision-making between Italy and Belgium to, you would argue, institutional differences.
Let's not go quite down to name individual countries. Let me make a point that is, so far I think we agree with the general commentary. Let me bring in the point that I think an economist should bring in, which is that when you create a rigid monetary cage, you are locking in situations which over time are going to have effects. So Italy has, for a number of reasons, a system that relies in part on devaluation to sort of readjust the imbalances, which are largely created by internal political conflicts and other things. And once it joined the Union, it could not devalue anymore. So it should have gotten its own internal convergence, which is very difficult. It's like asking a country to change their culture, or even better, how to change different bits of the country to change their individual country, which is even more difficult. But there is an effect that no one talks about. Italy used to be the second largest manufacturing country in Europe. It's not well known. It was doing not necessarily the highest end, but it had a large industrial sector than France. It was very much a country relying on trade to compensate for the huge deficit spending. And locking into a monetary union with stronger country had the effect, not only that Italy couldn't devalue, but essentially it led to a revaluation of the currency. Just at the same time as you offer a fantastic devaluation for the core. So countries like the Netherlands or Germany that had historically very strong currency, by joining a monetary union with weaker country, had the position, from a productive point of view, of greatly benefiting from this consolidation. So Italy ended up being increasingly caged into the wrong price, that they couldn't compensate anymore its gradual building up of weakness as it did with devaluation, and essentially became more and more and more uncompetitive. This is part of what no one talks about. There are large general equilibrium effect when you lock things together. And this is actually proving that from the beginning, the monetary union is an exchange, is a transfer union, except the transfer through the common monetary framework goes from the weak to the strong. This view is not much air, but it's, I think, pretty much at the heart to understand the decline of Italian performance on the tradable sector.
Mr. Gros, how does this assessment of Mr. Perotti that the rigidity of the Eurozone has also effects on convergence and divergence between Eurozone members? With your view that I understand is more the convergence and divergence effect are independent of Eurozone membership.
Exactly. I would say that Italy's decline dates from the mid-1990s already, so pre-monetary union. And I think there has been decline in the productivity of Italian manufacturing and kind
Before.
of product mix, which is, the question then is it easier to manage this kind of decline with a floating currency or within the euro? But let me put that just aside. If I
It
take,
seems to me a bit crucial, right?
let me just press one other question.
Okay, let's put it aside.
If you had, just for a minute, if you had this discussion in 2005, we would have said Germany and other countries linked to it entered this at a hugely overvalued exchange rate. Germany has difficulties, has been priced out of the markets. It's no longer competitive. There's no longer inflation here. So the poor Germans are doomed.
Okay.
Right? Fast forward 10 years.
To today?
Things have changed. Why? Might be it was luck, right? We have China, which asks for a lot of big cars and machine tools, which the Germans are producing, and perhaps initially less of the things the Italians are producing. Who knows, right? But I think to label certain countries as weak and strong is always.
Point being, since 2005, the common currency
Yeah.
was the same, but domestic factors have
Yeah.
changed.
Now, what I want to come back to Enrico's point is that it is true that perhaps if you have a country where you have bad institutions, it's more difficult to deal with changes, especially negative changes. But if you look at all the indicators of quality of governance in Italy, actually you see that Italy today is not the same as Italy in the past. If I take the WTI indicators,
Yeah.
then Italy of 1995, 6, 7, right, and so on, was about 1 standard deviation below the European average. Now it is more than 2 standard deviations below the European average. So there has been a huge deterioration of the governance.
So if deterioration, in your opinion, is not because of the euro, why then people blame the euro? Why do people make this argument?
Well, that's a big question. There's one question whether for a given level of the quality of governance, you have more difficulty staying inside than outside, right? And then the question is, why did it deteriorate? Now, the deterioration started earlier than the euro. It has multiple causes, political system, and so on. But I would say that is the main reason. And then it comes why, if you look at the last crisis, and you ask yourself which countries exited first, or managed best with the crisis, and then you ask yourself which countries were the ones which said the foreigners are responsible. You see a very strong correlation. The Irish said, we goofed up, we better get this stuff ready, and they were out immediately. The Greeks said, it's all the fault of the foreigners. They were forced to do certain adjustments, they were not really implemented, and they're still there. And I think in Italy you have something similar.
So it's a blame game.
Mr. Perotti, would you like to answer?
Yeah, so a couple of things. On the last point, the reason that some countries got hit by the crisis was that they were overexposed in what was the immediate cause of the crisis, which had to do with the securitization, the mortgage boom, the bubbles, and that includes the Netherlands, England, Ireland, and with some delay Spain. If Italy came in trouble, it's not because it had gambled the way this other country had during the credit boom. Italy didn't even have a rise in house prices. Italy had essentially a weak position already then, that after 7 years of recession, finally cracked the banking system. You don't have even the huge scandal, with one example, in terms of how the lending took place, or the Italian economy has been just weakening for years without the ability of compensating its structural weakness with devaluation as it did in the past, while contributing to the strength of countries that benefit from the current arrangement. Let me make one example. Compare net manufacturing, these are facts.
Yeah.
Compare the situation of Dutch export. The Dutch have always been the big exporting country, but in part because it's been importing a lot, right? So that's the process. Look at the indicator, the most sensitive component of the economy in terms of exchange rate, the tradable sector. Take net manufacturing export, okay?
Yeah.
The Netherlands has always had a good manufacturing sector, but it was in deficit in the 90s and historically. Since that, the net manufacturing export in the Netherlands has been rising steadily. Now it's actually large surplus, while Italy struggle, even Spain struggle. So I think that is the most price sensitive of all segments. If you want to look at a segment, it will suffer with from an overvaluation. That's where you want to look. So it is absolutely right what Daniel said, that Italy would have suffered anyway in the reallocation of production, because Italy was at the high end of low value-added sectors often. Yeah, that's not the only thing, but a lot of it. So of course Italy would have suffered from China and other places.
Yeah.
Like other
The
countries.
deterioration would have happened regardless.
But there would have been the historical ability to readjust and maintain competitiveness.
Would have been more flexibility.
There would be more flexibility. Look, Italy always had before the same problem, overspending, too many taxes, the tradable sector suffers, and at some point they would devalue, and the tradable sector would breathe and be able to carry the debt further. But that mechanism doesn't work anymore.
Because of the Eurozone, okay.
So I want to repeat once more time that the monetary union, the way it was set up, was from the beginning a union of transfer, hidden transfer, the one that you don't see, the one that don't have economists go and point at accounting numbers and say, look, there is a transfer, we give money to Greece. I would claim that the countries like Italy and Spain and Greece contribute to the ability of this country to keep producing very competitively. And there is a traditional habit of people to self-attribute the success and blame others for the failures.
I see. So I think now it's a good time, before we go into Italy, what's happening currently in Italy, to go to the audience and see if there's any questions regarding convergence and the Eurozone architecture. Anyone? Yes, over here. Could you please stand up?
Hi, yeah, so I feel like a lot of the rhetoric behind all this crisis in the Eurozone has to do with this blame game of, well, who is really responsible for the current crises in Greece and Italy? Wouldn't you two agree that maybe instead of continuing this kind of he said, she said type rhetoric for the Euro crisis, that maybe the true way forward should be to say, well, instead of asking who is responsible, the more wealthy countries of the European Union, like Germany and the Netherlands, asking themselves, well, this situation is like this already. What can we do to help these other countries in the Union and overall call for better unity?
Okay. Mr. Gros.
Well, the answer would be the rich countries can do very little. I mean, as I said, the premise of monetary union then was that all you get through the monetary union is a stable currency. Whether you grow in the long term, whether your exports remain competitive, what are your internal structures, that is determined at home. So I would say 90 to 95% of your success or not are determined at home, and then there's 5% perhaps the monetary part, with an important proviso, the financial markets, right?
Yeah.
They have to be brought, so to speak, under control, right? But at that I think we have done now with the creation of the banking union and so on. We can discuss that, but still. So apart from that aspect, I think it is at home that you create
Wealthy
prosperity.
countries cannot do that much. Only bailout countries.
I mean, everybody creates its own condition for success or not in terms of countries, and certainly neither the Netherlands nor whatever Germany can somehow reform Italy. Only the Italians can do that.
Mr. Perotti.
Well, so I want to stress what I was saying about self-attribution bias. The Italians blame others for the fact that things go badly, and the core congratulates itself on how well it's doing. But more seriously, I disagree on the proportion. I do agree that the majority of the responsibility is always with the country. But let me give you a thought experiment. Suppose Arkansas and very poor agricultural country, actually even better, Arkansas and California get two different currency. Do you think the Arkansas dollar will be weak and the California dollar be strong? Presumably. Now, suppose you make a monetary union of the two, who's going to benefit? And why do you have a fiscal system that redistributes appropriately the balance? Now, I'm not going to propose, I think there are limits to what the rich country can do, but the first step would be to admit that part of their success is at the cost of others, as it is in any union, in some form, as opposed to other. I think the main help that this system could do, aside from some amount of solidarity, would be actually to create a fiscal discipline at the core. So not just do some amount of fiscal transfer, which I think is legitimate on economic grounds, and not out of charity, as someone seemed to suggest, but I think you also have to impose limits to the power of countries with less fiscal discipline to spend. You have to say, you cannot, if you want to enter this arrangement, you cannot make choices on the pension system independently as you did before. Now, how likely is this to happen?
Yeah, we will discuss the form of those transfers later on in the interview. But now, Mr. Gros, we would like to talk with both of you, actually, about the Italian situation right now. So as you guys know, and probably the audience as well, Italy proposed a budget recently, and it was denied, and then did not change it again. And in this proposal, they would increase spending, and that violates the complex fiscal rules of the European Union. However, if we look at the countries that have violated these rules in the past, we see that France and Germany pop up. Mr. Gros, why is the European Commission now in this position, trying to intervene in this situation with Italy? Yeah.
First of all, in the 2003 or 4 episode, when France and Germany banded together with Italy, the Commission was proposing to take steps against Germany and France. And it was overruled in the Council of Ministers. And actually, the European Commission took the Council of Ministers to the European Court, saying what you have done is not legal. And the court said, what are you saying? The Council of Ministers is the place which decides, right? Tough luck, right? And now the Commission does nothing else, right? It again proposes things. Right? The question is, now in the Council of Ministers, now the Germans and French sit pretty, right? Now, what is more important, I think, is, of course, two wrongs don't make a right? Typical thing, you're being stopped by the police and say, but this other guy also speeded, why me, right? That's not the way. But what's very important about this particular episode is that the country doesn't say, okay, we recognize the rules, but we need a bit more. But that the political leadership says, we don't care for the rules.
Yeah.
And this brings me back to what Enrico said earlier. Let's have some transfers, and then the country accepts that it cannot change its pension system. And this country here just says, sorry guys, changing the pension system is my own sovereign decision. You cannot take that away. So, what do you do?
It's a very political position by the European Commission.
But it just shows that you cannot have these rules, which many people advocate, right? And we have these rules, right? But countries remain ultimately sovereign. When they say no, we don't follow them. There's nothing the EU can do.
But what about the more economic argument in favor of this, in favor of the extra spending by the Italian government? Economist Ashok Modi from the IMF has argued that, in fact, Italy could potentially use this extra spending, given that they will probably lead given the trade tensions and their borrowing costs increasing, it will probably lead to recession in Italy, which it means that they exactly need at this moment a stimulus.
Within the next 2 quarters. So
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, but sorry, okay, we become a long discussion.
I think I probably agree on. I agree with everything Daniel said this round, and I think I agree with the notion that the Commission is powerless, actually, in the current situation. It is possible for a country to become constrained. Monetary union is an abdication of sovereign power. You cannot print money. So it is possible. You could impose, I mean, you have to have people sign up.
Yeah.
And that's the difficult part. But I do think there is something, it is true that France has broken the rules for 8 years running, or 9, and then they kept saying, I'm sorry, but I need a bit more time. They broke it for 9 years. Now, Italy breaks it, and Italy is in a weaker position. And I think it's more serious. It is more serious, exactly for the reason Daniel said. Because these are irresponsible promises. You create expectation you cannot maintain.
Yeah.
And you also encourage this sort of blame story, which, however, is taking place in all countries.
Blame story, the Italians blaming the euro or the European Union?
The Greek blaming the Germans, the Italian blaming the euro, the German blaming the Greek. I think that's a sad situation. I think the point is the situation is complex. However, it's very hard to explain to the general public who's doing what, and also why they should do something. So I think the political discourse falls at a very low level. I mean, in good time, it's easier to sort of say, oh, let's get together. In bad time, each for themselves, and that's sad, because that's exactly against the European principle. I mean, we're much more close in many ways culturally.
Now, you said that the European Commission is basically powerless and Italy is in a weak position, but there is a procedure at the hand of the European Commission, an excessive debt program with economic sanctions being imposed. And on the part of Italy, we see they threaten with their plan B, with leaving the Eurozone, which would have dramatic effects for the rest of the members of the Eurozone. So aren't we seeing this game of chicken where both race at each other with their threats and hope that the Big Bang...
I don't think neither will happen. I mean, Italy may ultimately have to break out, but the government will not voluntarily leave. Also because Italians don't want to leave the euro. So.
Though meanwhile, there is a cost to this game. If it's even effectless, but I mean, investors are losing their trust in Italian government bonds. We see their borrowing costs rising. So why is the Italian government willing to go into this conflict where you think there will be no results, no real results, at this cost?
I mean, these are a bunch of populists with little clues. I mean, they do what works. I mean, Salvini, for instance, there is a backlash in Italy against this particular. For instance, the North is furious about the citizenship income, most of it, and the South is enthusiastic. This is the famous old story. And Salvini is going along with it because he has the opportunity to be on the stage, to be the big nationalist guy, and wins a lot of votes. I mean, I think he might be. In the end, the government breaks up, the Lega teams up with someone else, and then the citizen income will be sort of pared down. I don't know. I think things are never resolved in clear ways in Italy, but it's not sustainable. It's not going to happen that they can maintain this promise. It's also not sustainable that the Commission realistically can do a whole lot.
So you don't think it's a sustainable government, the Italian government?
No. The government can continue. What is not sustainable is the policy. You cannot keep paying out in real terms because the cost is going up.
Of course.
The cost is not just default risk. It's literally that you have fewer people willing to put money into Italy. You're bargaining over how much you pay. Even if in the end there is no default, which I'm not sure, but it's, in some sense, even without default, you can pay more. Right? And that's what is also self-defeating, of course. So no, I don't think it can be sustained very long, this policy.
No, this reminds me of a similar situation we had with Greece, where there was a popular government trying to stand up against the European institutions, and eventually was forced into into submission. How come you don't believe the similar kind of situation can occur?
Well,
it's too big.
Germany was bankrupt. Sorry, Germany. Greece was sorry, lapsus.
No, Germany was bankrupt twice last century.
If you look at what country has had the highest inflation on average last century, you know what that is.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I think the Greeks were totally on their knees. I mean, and the Greeks did not want. I mean, when you come to the final confrontation, if you tell the Italians you want to leave the euro or not, they don't. But you know, we're not there yet, and so there's space for populists to create damage. Why not?
Yeah, you'd like to comment on that?
Italy is not Greece, and vice versa. Among the many differences, the key one is Greece needed financing from foreign official sources. So they needed to go to Merkel and say, please finance us. First she said, I have these conditions. They make a referendum, totally against. And then they come back, yes, but what do we do? Okay. So in the end, they accepted anyway. But they needed something from Merkel, from the European, from the countries. Italy does not need that.
Not yet.
No, Italy is self-financing. Most of the stock of that is held by Italians. Italy, the country, runs a current account surplus, which means that there's more savings than financing need inside, right? So Italy does not need a big loan from abroad. It just needs to basically make sure that its own citizens finance its own government, right? It's a distribution problem, left pocket, right pocket within Italy. And that is what's different. So Italy needs to basically convince its own citizens to buy its own government bonds. It doesn't need a big loan from the EU. And therefore the Commission and the EU as such can just sit there and say, look guys, anyway, this is not a case where we need to put in our money. This is something which you have to clarify and manage within Italy. In Italy, if you just put in capital controls and keep all the Italian savings in Italy, there's enough money there for the Italian government.
So where do you see this conflict going?
That's where I see it going. If the government tries to keep these unsustainable policies, and then if basically nobody buys Italian government bonds, then the Italians have basically to put a fence around.
So market discipline is going to become difficult for Italy.
Market discipline is the thing that works in this case. In the past, we had zero market discipline and then too much. But this is a case where it comes on gradual, and it's up to the government to decide when they cannot pay. They're paying 300 basis points now, tomorrow 400, who knows? And at a certain point, they will have to throw in the towel.
Now, in a relatively short time, we've seen this conflict emerge and accelerate. It's a fast-changing environment. Beginning of February, I believe you wrote an article where you said that the Eurozone is an island of stability. Now, with the third largest economy of the Eurozone challenging the rules, challenging the Commission, would you like to revisit that statement of February?
I think it was based on the economics. And the economics for Italy, actually also including Italy, were very good. The marginal cost of government debt for Italy was less than 1%. Nominal GDP growth rate was almost 2.5, 3. Ideal financing conditions. If the new government had done nothing, right, then the country would be fine. Okay, where my mistake was not to anticipate that populists come. But as I say, in Northern Europe, we have mostly right-wing populists who care about throwing foreigners out, but they don't want to run large deficit. And in Italy, you had this unhappy coalition, a little bit like in Greece, between right-wing and left-wing populists, and everybody competes on handing out more money, and that's what led to this unsustainable situation.
So a political crisis at heart.
Yeah, outside Italy, the Eurozone is doing fine.
All right. I guess this is a good point again to see if there's some Italians in our audience who'd like to comment on this, if there's any other questions on the Italian case. I'm part of the audience.
No
Any
questions?
questions on the euro?
Question from the euro. Oh, there. Could you please get up? Stand up.
Hi. Hello?
Yes.
Well, okay. How could you say that the conditions when the government was established were fine, even economically speaking, when 1/3 of the population was out of jobs? There was a really high disoccupation in the country.
Yeah. Mr.
I
Gros.
think it's directed at you, Mr. Gros.
I mean,
believe.
yeah. I mean, you can only distribute what you produce, right? If your economy is not that large, then there's not a lot the government can produce. The high unemployment in Italy, actually the youth unemployment, which I presume you mentioned, has been a constant feature of Italy for a very long time. And actually, now I have to come to the numbers. There are actually more unemployed, I think, young Britons or French than unemployed Italians, young Italians. Why? Because the unemployment rate among the youth is calculated among those who actually want to work. But you have a very large percentage of young people in Italy who are neither looking for a job nor in education, the so-called needs, right? If you look at the unemployment ratio, right? So you just ask yourself, out of 100 youth in Italy, how many are looking for a job and are unemployed? Then you see that that ratio is not 13%, but 15%, which is actually much more similar to other countries. So not to say that there's no problem, but there's a structural problem with the Italian economy in the way young Italians themselves are going about looking for a job, and the economy which actually offers jobs, opportunity, and opportunities to train. This has very little to do with the euro. And this you cannot change with just more government subsidies.
Mr. Perotti, would you like to comment?
So I think there is something that has to do with the euro in the sense tendentially the Italian economy is becoming less competitive. That doesn't mean that there are no responsibilities with the country. I mean, Germany made a serious labor reform when it was in a weak spot, not in a deep crisis, but in a weak spot. Spain has done remarkably. Italy is, for a number of reasons, more divided. The set of expectations are much higher, and that's part of the problem, that people are actually not willing to do as much personal adjustment. I heard many people say in Spain, people have little choice, they have to adapt. In Italy, there's still a pension system, there's still money around, there's more pride, there's more expectation. The adjustment is tougher. In the end, it has to happen. But I think what is not entirely fair is that people don't understand that it's this adjustment that will take a long time to take place until people can sort of find some form of employment is hindered by being in the monetary union, not helped.
Thank you for the question. We're going to now move into another topic of our interview, and that is about some of the reforms that have been recently proposed to modify the Eurozone. And a number of them turn around or circle around the topic of fiscal integration. Now, Mr. Perotti, and I fear that you two will disagree on this, but the former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl famously said when the euro was introduced, it would never, ever, and should ever become a transfer union. Do you think this statement is still appropriate? Has it been overtaken by events? What is your
I think it was a transfer union from day one. I just made my point. I mean, of course, initially not very much, but over time, as I say, Italy, because of its own internal imbalance, issues of governance, diversity, poor regions, etc., has a difficulty doing keeping up and adjusting. It's an institutional feature. It's just not an act of will only. It's just objective to some extent. And that's why devaluation helped. Now, if you, I think the transfer union increasingly is taking place in a world in which, in a way that is redistributed not just across country, but also within countries. I mean, for instance, a system of less high exchange rate for Holland works very well for young people, for production. Works a bit less well for the old people who have savings, because if they had a higher currency, they could go on holiday more often. Now, what do you want the country to rely on? In Italy, savers do better than they would outside the union because they have a hard currency. And the youth is crushed because the tradable sector just cannot compete. And the non-tradable, of course, has used up all the sort of fiscal capacity. So I think we have to recognize it's a fiction that it was a non-tradable union. We didn't understand it well enough. I think by now you cannot deny it.
But would you say that the solution is to make it a transfer union?
Now, I think you need to have a combination of some fiscal solidarity and fiscal discipline with transfer of spending power away from, from the periphery.
Mr. Gros, you on the other side, you said I think you've mentioned it even in this interview that, and I think you wrote it in an article you recently wrote, and you wrote a fundamental truth that no European leaders should forget is that no predominantly domestic problem will ever be resolved by a loan or transfer from resources from abroad. How does this idea square off with Mr. Perotti's argument of the architecture of the euro and its imbalances?
First of all, what do we mean by transfer union? That, let's say, certain governments transfer money to other governments.
Well, there's different ways,
There's
right,
different ways,
to make this happen.
We have already the structural funds from the EU, right? So they're working and they're existing and they help, because they transfer on resources too. My view is that you cannot really change the growth trajectory of a country if you hand the government a little bit more money, or even a lot more money. And the famous Dutch disease, right? Argument you all know. That's why I'm very skeptical about this idea that we actually would need such a. If I take Italian situation today, and if the Italian government were to get X% of GDP in the transfer from a European pot of money, why should that improve Italian growth prospects, employment?
Well,
Maybe not even the political, not even the fiscal situation, because they will say, we have this money, we can spend even more.
Well, that's not what I was proposing, but I think you should, let me take the example of the structural funds. The structural funds have been cases where money was given to Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia to build roads and infrastructure. It's worked quite well, by and large, as far as I can tell. Now, the problem is, if you were to, so I never suggest handing, look, I'm a Dutch taxpayer for 25 years. So I don't want to hand money to Italian politicians. I definitely don't want to do that. The question is whether you can allocate resource in a conditional way, in some cases even by direct implementation, going over the head, if necessary, and essentially do it against in exchange for giving up some institutional power, such as spending power or pension policy. I do agree that it's not easy to change the informal institution of a country, but formal institution can be changed, just like monetary union proves.
What I take from both your accounts is basically a distrust towards the institutions in the peripheral Eurozone members to actually make good use of the money that would be in whatever form given to them and to invest it efficiently in their economies. How can this...
Sorry, but if I may say so, that is one point which is very important. But the other more general point I want to make is that just a transfer from abroad, even to a well-governed country,
It's not enough.
Perhaps increases the consumption possibility frontier. You can consume more. But I yet have to see a study which shows that that will lead to higher growth. Right? That is a different proposition. And I come back, I mean, the famous term Dutch disease was coined because you have this effect that if you have a transfer from abroad, then your wages in general go up and the tradable sector, the exporting sector suffers. And therefore I come back, it doesn't make sense in general, and then in particular in countries or regions where the local governance is bad.
Well, aren't you throwing the Keynesian book just out of the window just now, saying that if a government can't actually provide fiscal stimuluses and it can't provide growth through doing that? One question is, of course, where does that money come from? Does it come domestically from borrowing, or does it come from a transfer? But this, to me, seems just a question of where the money comes from and not how you invest it and how it's going to generate growth.
So let me agree with with what Daniel said. I think we spend too much time thinking like Keynesians. It's true. You can spend more this year, and income will be higher this year because you're forcefully de-saving. That doesn't create growth. Growth is a structural phenomenon. I think we share that. So the fact you give money doesn't create growth. It transfers resources from the future to today. Sure. That's what the government can do. It doesn't create growth. Now, some qualification should be done because there is some public investment that you can do. Again, I think the money we spent in Eastern Europe, a lot of it, which was money given to governments, was largely useful. You know, there are plenty of exceptions, I'm sure. But the infrastructure is being transformed in Central and Eastern Europe to good use. Certainly the German exporters have, and there's been a lot of relocation there. So I think you can direct resources to obviously missing infrastructure elements.
So in Italy it will be infrastructure?
Also in Italy. The biggest problem is that you don't want to give it to the local politicians. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, if you could just go and build it. So I don't want to minimize, I don't think there's a simple solution. And I do think that the money shouldn't be just handed out. And I do think that most of the time when you do hand it out, it's wasted or it doesn't change growth at all. Yeah. You might make things worse because, as in the case of the Dutch disease, you raise expectation, you raise wages, and when the money's over, you're in a worse situation than before. So it depends.
You would argue then that we should centralize fiscal competences in a place like Brussels, and then from Brussels decide where to spend in Italy.
Well, that would be a grand bargain. Yeah. I'm not sure I would put it in Brussels.
The Italians tried to do that within Italy, and they did succeed.
Well, one of the biggest disasters in Italy has been the fiscal decentralization that came with the expansion of the region and the ridiculous expansion in regional government spending. There's been a disaster, real disaster. We would be doing much better without that.
One of the reforms that has been agreed upon by both the French and the Germans has been to introduce by 2021 a Eurozone finance minister with a Eurozone budget. I think in the Mesmer declaration, that's what they said, according to my research. But do you see, Mr. Gros, Mr. Perotti first, do you see any worth in these reforms? Are they potential solutions in
I mean, by now it's little more than an empty box. I mean, I think Macron wanted something much more significant. I think he got his box, and inside the box there are some crumbs. I mean, I think they're talking
some
about
breadcrumbs.
20 billion.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
So, and you, Mr. Gros?
This talk about a finance minister is just giving somebody who is now called European Commissioner responsible for economic and financial affairs the title European Minister of Finance. Doesn't change anything.
It doesn't change the institutional framework, indeed. Yeah.
And I think even that will become much less likely because, as I said, if you have one large country which says the rules, we don't care, which is totally different from saying the rules are tight, could you please make an exception for us? And then waiting to be granted an exception. That is totally different from basically saying you drive on the road, policeman stops you and says, look, I have to go to the hospital in a hurry, can you please allow me to go at 55? I said, okay, go. And if somebody else coming in at 60 and says, I don't care, I just want to go at whatever speed I like. And then the policeman will say, no, that's not the way it works. And that's why this Italian government is so important, because it makes any reform of the Eurozone which has any element that we agree on rules, we agree to be bound, we, national governments, makes it basically worthless.
See, but regarding, I see both of you are quite negative on the Eurozone finance minister. Isn't there a more symbolic argument behind it? A Eurozone finance minister does sound much unifying than a commissioner.
That's the worst. To have somebody with a big title and then he cannot do anything.
No, but it would start because the history of European integration seems to be about incremental reforms and incremental progress. Couldn't this be a step on the right direction?
No, this is like a cover-up. I mean, come on. It's nothing. There is no step. Aside from the fact there is not much money, there is no shift in the structure. Why should anything change? No, I think you're just... I mean, I think Macron wanted more, and the Germans didn't see the point of it.
So we should not have reforms built on the already existing treaties, but have a new treaty.
No. So you can have incremental steps,
Okay.
but not incremental steps then giving titles, but doing something concrete.
So it would mean potentially more firepower for this Eurozone finance minister.
Yeah, but what would he spend, right? You could give him a budget and you could say, let's create a European army, right? And put more for a defense minister, right? But it makes sense only if you say, what should be spent at the European level, right? Security, maybe research, innovation. There are certain things we can do incrementally, starting small. But to say, just have a finance minister, just the words don't mean anything. It is the actual function he or she has.
Now, you say that these reforms fall short of anything effective to actually modernize the Eurozone. This doesn't square with this idea that 2018 was supposed to be the effective reform year for the Eurozone, where we are after Macron's speech at the Sorbonne, before Mario Draghi's turn as ECB president ends, and before the European Parliament election next year. Why were there no meaningful reforms this year, despite this prediction?
I was of the opinion, I still remain, that we don't need a lot of big reforms for the euro area. There are certain things, certain loose ends which we might want to adjust.
Banking union.
Banking union, but this is all secondary. We need nothing big, fundamental to have it work. Of course, provided we have sensible or semi-sensible governments inside.
Which is a big assumption to take at the moment.
Yeah, but if we cannot create a Eurozone on the basis of governments who say, today the treaty is nice, tomorrow I don't care.
What would be necessary to fix that, if I may?
You cannot fix it. We are not like the United
That's it.
In the United States, when one part of the country said, we are walking away, the other country said, you can't.
Yeah.
Right? They sent in the army. We cannot, as we see with Great Britain, right? If somebody wants to walk, we can only say bye-bye.
So that's your take at it. Say bye-bye, wave goodbye.
We cannot force countries to behave except that we give a certain framework of monetary stability and rules which should be in their own interest. If they don't abide by them, there's nothing much we can do.
Mr. Perotti?
Well, obviously I disagree. I think it's not because I think something will happen, but something could be done. I do agree that you can do small things that are sensible. Let me start with this. The European army, I mean, I'm definitely not a military person. However, I think that if you want to spend money on something that would give a sense of identity, security, unity, that would be a start. And the best thing could have been done 3 years ago when there were the massive emigration from Africa crossing the Mediterranean. Even the Merkel say Italy was left alone. Yeah? And Italy is a cash-strapped country. That was a moment where you could have said, this is a common responsibility, because in the end it is. You know, people will arrive everywhere. And then the chance was missed. So I think first, I do think we need something structural, and I do not think that we're just fine, because if governments like this awful government are elected, it's endogenous. If you don't fix something, it will progressively build up. No. That's part of my point. And second, yes, we can also start with things that work, and I can imagine some. And it's certainly...
I think your idea of grand bargaining would require not only reforms on the existing treaties, but it would require essentially recreating the treaties.
Yes.
Recreating, essentially...
Yeah, that's why I'm not optimistic. But yes, I think that would be the considering the whole thing. And you can choose priority areas. It's not, again, I don't ever suggest giving money to Italian politicians. I don't trust them. I didn't trust the one before. So the point is a bit structural there. So, but you can, at the same time, recognize and empathize with what the country has to deal with inside the cage it currently is, because it is not just a state, it's a trend. And populism rises when you have more and more pressure building up in some spot.
But
right?
I mean, if you have a European army, that doesn't change the economic problems in Italy.
It would help to not elect migration screeching populists. That would be a start.
Momentum.
Sorry, one step at a time. The question was not about migration at the beginning, about populist pressure in Italy due to the economic underperformance. My question is, what kind of spending at the European level would have a meaningful impact on economic performance in Italy?
So I already said it, but let me repeat. Infrastructure, I don't know how long since you've been going to the southern Italy, I see the highways and the things. The country has been squeezed by excessive debt for a long time. The infrastructure is not doing well. And that's one step. That's where you could do. And the biggest problem has been not just the fact that others have not wanted to give money. The problem has also been the local Italian government has been a problem. So you have to solve it at the federal level. I mean, there is a federal army of engineers that went into Florida to do things because they didn't trust the local politicians, right? So
perhaps to conclude our interview, because unfortunately we're running out of time, on a more unifying note between the two of you, it seems there is an agreement here that the current political discourse and political disagreement has immediate effects also on the sustainability of the Eurozone. Now, with Macron having domestic issues to care with right now, Merkel basically being a lame duck, whom do you turn to for this political will, perhaps, that you've been talking about, for a more unifying political will in the next foreseeable future? Whom do you look at? Is there someone?
Political will is not a question of people, right, or some leaders up. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have seen in the past momentum being generated by true Europeans like Macron, Merkel, and Mario Draghi. So.
Okay. Anyway, so to change the political discourse in Italy, that you can't do at the European level.
Okay.
I disagree.
Okay. Well, that was that attempt.
So that doesn't take away the fact that ultimately, the responsibilities are with Italy to agree to what needs to happen. And so I don't want to here go to the game of blaming others again, right?
Okay.
So, but I think there are things you could do that would be very meaningful. Let me repeat. If 3 years ago, the Italians, they were swamped by immigrants in a situation that was quite uncontrolled, had felt that Europe was coming to help and that there was a common boundary, of course, the economic malaise would have been there, but there would have been a sense of solidarity and connection. It would have stopped the right-wing populists. Also, by the way, the left-wing populists are anti-immigration in Italy. It would have deflated at least that component. And, the chance was missed.
Mr. Perotti, Mr. Gros, thank you very much for the lively debate today.
Okay.